A rising chorus of voices are telling the world what the John Birch Society has proclaimed since 1958. To get the United States out of the UN and get the UN out of the United States. Professor Alan Dershowitz has just added his voice in one of his latest podcasts. Now recall that Representative Matt Gaetz suggested the very same thing from the stage at CPAC earlier this year, while Sean Hannity suggested the same last year. And for the first time, there are two bills sitting in the U.S. House and Senate designed to do just that. So what are we waiting for? We'll cover this and explain how you can help in today's analysis behind the news, perspective, and solutions you won't get anywhere else. If you're concerned about American independence and freedom, then please watch and take the recommended actions. And be sure to like, subscribe, and share so we can break through big tech censorship and reach many others. On June 12th, Professor Dershowitz live-streamed a podcast that he titled, "The UN Does More Harm Than Good, Should Be Booted Out of the U.S.?" He said that the United Nations was a source of much of the hatred toward Jews and suggested that instead of a dove being the UN symbol, that it should be changed to the unknown pro-Palestinian protester who said that he wishes Hitler was still here. Dershowitz pointed to the UN recently accusing Israel of war crimes while saying that such countries as Syria, Iran, and China have never been called out by the UN for their war crimes. And he's not the only one recently calling out the UN. Writing for the Washington Examiner, Michael Rubin asked, could the Israel-Hamas war be the death knell for the United Nations? And suggests the UN tends to avoid any accountability. But, he wrote, a second Trump administration may change that. He also quipped, John Birch Society conservatism never posed the threat to U.S. support for the UN that Trump might. For the first time in decades, UN exit is a possibility. Well, since our founding days, the John Birch Society has called for the U.S. to get out of the UN and for the UN to get out of the U.S. JBS founder Robert Welch said at the founding meeting, a part of that plan of world domination, of course, is to induce the gradual surrender of American sovereignty piece by piece and step by step to various international organizations, of which the United Nations is the outstanding but far from the only example, while the communists are simultaneously and equally gradually getting complete working control of such organizations. Communists have played a large role in founding the United Nations and subsequently leading the organization toward the communist goal of implementing a new world order under the UN's world government. As the John Birch Society has repeatedly pointed out, the charters of the UN are antithetical to the US's founding documents. The Founding Fathers gave us limited government that protects God-given rights. The UN looks at it quite the opposite, with government granting rights. Yet, for what should be an easy decision for our elected officials to make, most turn a blind eye and suggest that the UN should just be reformed. For example, in 2005, U.S. Representative Henry Hyde went so far as to introduce the UN Reform Act, which offered more than 100 pages of reforms. In contrast, U.S. Representative Ron Paul introduced the American Sovereignty Restoration Act of 2005, which only took 7 pages to end the membership of the United States in the United Nations. While we have advocated for the very same thing, traction among the American people was built quicker than the support in Congress. As written in a newer introduction in the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, when the Society started this campaign, 80% of the American people supported the UN, and by the year 2000, less than 35% felt that we should remain a member of the UN. It wasn't until December of last year when the U.S. Senate finally introduced the DEFUND Act, which stands for Disengaging Entirely from the United Nations Debacle. Introduced by Senator Mike Lee, it joins a companion bill introduced by Representative Chip Roy in the U.S. House. The U.S. bill has only 7 co-sponsors, while the Senate has 3. It's time to crank up support for these bills. Even if they are not passed and signed by President Biden, the work put into organizing support will carry over into 2025, and as pointed out before, we might be near the tipping point if the next president is on board. So what would it look like if the U.S. were to get out of the United Nations? First of all, 28% of the UN's budget is funded by the United States. That's $18 billion in 2023 alone. the UN would not be able to sustain this loss long term and would eventually collapse. No other country would be able to fill this gap. Second, this club of dictators is not interested in adopting freedom and does all it can to disarm the world's population from weapons that protect the people from tyrants. I saw a meme recently that said the only reason the government wants to disarm you is because it is planning to do something that you would shoot them for. Well, there's plenty of truth behind that one. By getting out of the UN, we would be helping to preserve the Second Amendment, the rest of our liberties, as well as the constitutional limitations of government. Again, the UN has no such apparatus for limitations. It wants to control you and to get rid of government limitations. A perfect example of this is the UN's Agenda 2030. In this program are 17 goals that the UN wants to accomplish. All 17 are outside of the constitutional limitations of the federal government, which means that the states and the people have the power to legislate these topics. Yet the UN works hard to lobby Congress to achieve these goals. Many of these goals are being worked on due to fear-mongering under the false ruse of climate change. Support for initiatives like the Green New Deal and 15-minute cities would also crumble. So, get rid of the United Nations, and you've also made a major step towards protecting America's precious resources of water, food, and energy supplies, as well as protecting American industry from the onslaughts of government micromanagement, including manufacturing, mining, energy production, and farming. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals cover every aspect of your life, paving the way to gain control over everything you do and severely limiting the choices you make. Getting rid of the UN gets rid of its political influence among elected officials, not just in Congress, but throughout local and state governments. Getting rid of the UN also gets rid of its many detrimental treaties that are unconstitutionally signed by various U.S. presidents. Each treaty or agreement is crafted to shift control and diminish American sovereignty. These include canceling treaties on arms control, climate change, forced acceptance of refugees, attacks on the environment, participation of the U.S. military within UN forces, and, one of my favorites, eliminating the treaties that allow the UN to be headquartered in the U.S. Getting rid of the UN would also deliver a killing blow to the sought-after merger of the 3 North American countries. Stopping this globalist initiative prevents an unaccountable and tyrannical government bureaucracy being built above each of the federal governments, much like the European Union. Getting rid of the UN would safeguard American freedom, independence, and sovereignty for generations to come. The Founding Fathers courageously fought a war for independence that all may be free of tyranny. Why in the world would we want to accept a buildup of world government that seeks to install worldwide tyranny, ending the great experiment of self-governance and freedom? Why would we accept globalism over Americanism, or even slavery over freedom? Lastly, getting rid of the United Nations would set back the timetable of conspiring globalist forces so far back, it would take at least another generation for them to recover. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would greatly propel the mission of the John Birch Society. Less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. For many decades, members of the John Birch Society have informed their fellow voters, elected officials, and those of influence within their communities of the dangers of the United Nations and what it truly means for the American way of life. Members are locally organized and engage in community activities to distribute educational literature and videos, including hosting a booth or table at conferences, gun shows, car shows, tractor shows, farmers markets, street fairs, state fairs, and Independence Day parades. Meeting and engaging concerned Americans through knocking on doors, hosting video showings, leading workshops, holding speaker presentations, and organizing ad hoc Get Us Out of the UN committees. Members also write letters to the editor, to their state legislators, their congressmen, and also call in to talk radio shows to discuss the dangers of the UN. Through all of these consistent efforts over the years, there is a large base of support to get rid of the UN. Both houses in Congress have finally caught up. They need to know that there is support among the electorate that will back their efforts. So contact Congress and tell them you support getting out of the UN and get others to do so too. Ask your state legislators to introduce a resolution calling upon Congress to support the DEFUND Act. Ask your U.S. Representative and U.S. Senators to co-sponsor and push for a vote on the DEFUND Act and get others to do so too. Distribute our related UN literature to inform others. We have pamphlets, Slim Jims, article reprints, yard signs, bumper stickers, booklets, banners, and books that all make the case to get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S. Do so today. Links are in the description. And if you really want to make a large impact, join the John Birch Society today to work with others in your local community. Many others are doing so right now throughout the rest of the country. Join a local chapter. Adding your local efforts will amplify this message even more. I'm Bill Hahn for the John Birch Society. Until next time, learn more and take action.